It was a bright, sunny afternoon when Jason, a young and adventurous tourist, stepped off the bus and into the heart of the historic city. He had always dreamt of visiting this place, known for its grand castles, ancient walls, and most of all, its famous royal guards. They were known for their serious and stoic expressions, standing tall in their military uniforms, without even flinching, no matter how much people tried to make them smile. Jason had heard stories from his friends about these guards. They never move, no matter what. His friend Mark had told him, "You can do anything, and they'll just stand there, unmoving like statues." To Jason, this sounded like a challenge. As he wandered through the city, the stunning architecture around him caught his attention, but it was the royal guards that intrigued him the most. They stood like statues outside the grand palace, motionless and vigilant. Jason couldn't help but admire their impressive discipline. He'd seen them in photos before, but standing right in front of them was a different experience. For a moment, Jason stood quietly, watching one of the guards closely. The guard was tall, wearing a sharp red uniform and holding a long, polished weapon. His face was stern, his eyes focused on the distance. Jason thought it was incredible how these guards could stay so still for hours without even blinking. They were like living statues, guarding something ancient and important. A mischievous thought crossed Jason's mind. What if he could make one of these guards smile or react? It seemed impossible, but the idea of breaking the silence seemed fun. Jason wasn't being disrespectful, not at first anyway. He just wanted to see how far he could go without getting in trouble. Jason walked closer to the guard, feeling a bit nervous but also excited. The guard didn't look at him, didn't move an inch. Jason stopped right in front of him. He stared up at the guard's serious face, and for a moment, just stood there. Everything was still. There was something almost magical about the moment, but Jason's curiosity grew, and he wanted to push the boundaries. A voice inside his head urged him on. "It'll just be a quick joke," he thought. "Just a little test. Let's see if they really can stay still no matter what." With a small smile, Jason took a step closer. He reached out his hand toward the guard's long weapon. It was so shiny, so perfectly held, just waiting to be touched. Jason's fingers brushed against the cold metal. He was half expecting the guard to shout at him or push him away, but the guard remained perfectly still, as if Jason didn't exist at all. Jason's heart raced. The thrill of the moment was too much to resist. He gave the weapon a quick tug, thinking it was all harmless fun. It wasn't meant to be serious. He was only playing around. After all, the guards were known to be unmoved by any action. Surely he could just touch the weapon and step back without anything happening. But the moment Jason grabbed hold of the weapon, something changed. The guard's body tensed slightly. Jason couldn't see his face, but he knew something had shifted. The air around them felt heavier. Jason's smile began to fade as he realized the guard hadn't flinched or spoken, but his grip on the weapon tightened ever so slightly. Jason pulled back his hand quickly, but the damage had been done. The guard had noticed, and now everything was about to change. Jason stepped back quickly, feeling a sudden rush of uncertainty. He had only meant to play a harmless prank, but now something didn't feel right. The guard had not reacted like the others he had seen in videos. There was no smile, no laughter, no moment of surprise. Instead, the guard stood even more still, his eyes locked forward, but there was a subtle change. The way the guard's posture shifted made Jason feel uneasy. For a moment, Jason thought maybe the guard hadn't noticed at all. "Maybe I got away with it," he thought to himself. But the stillness in the air around him suggested otherwise. He could almost feel the guard's silent judgment, even though nothing had been said. Jason couldn't help but smile nervously. Was he really in trouble? His curiosity got the better of him. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was his competitive nature, but Jason wanted to see just how far he could push this. The guard remained silent, unmoving, as if he had become part of the surrounding landscape. Jason stood there for a moment, thinking about what to do next. A voice in Jason's head whispered, "What if I try something else? Just to see how serious he really is. I can't leave without knowing for sure." With a mix of excitement and nervousness, Jason took another step toward the guard. He raised his hand slightly, almost hesitating, before reaching out for the weapon again. This time, he gripped it firmly. It wasn't just a light touch anymore. Jason pulled it gently, almost expecting the guard to stop him. But the guard didn't say anything. He didn't even flinch. His eyes stayed focused ahead, his hand still holding the weapon, his body completely unmoving. Jason's heart raced as he tried to imagine what might happen next. Surely, the guard would do something now, wouldn't he? The crowd around them, which had been bustling with tourists taking photos and chatting, began to quiet down. A few people had noticed what was going on and were starting to watch Jason and the guard. The feeling of being watched made Jason uncomfortable. Some people were laughing quietly, thinking it was just part of the act. But Jason wasn't sure how much longer the guard would tolerate this. Still, Jason held onto the weapon, wondering if he was about to make history as the first tourist to make one of these royal guards react. He tried to joke about it to himself, but the silence from the guard only made him feel more nervous. Then something unexpected happened. Without warning, the guard shifted. His arm moved slightly, and Jason felt a sudden force in the grip of the weapon. It wasn't violent, but it was firm. The guard's body was still, but now Jason could feel the power in the way the weapon was being held. It was as if the guard was waiting for something, waiting for Jason to realize that he had gone too far. Jason let go of the weapon in a flash, suddenly feeling the weight of his actions. The smile he had worn earlier disappeared, replaced by an expression of embarrassment. The silence around them seemed to stretch on for what felt like forever. The crowd, once full of energy, now held its breath. It was clear that something had changed. The royal guard, who had not said a word, finally gave a small movement with his head. It wasn't a nod, but it was enough to make Jason feel a chill run down his spine. That simple, small motion felt like a warning, like the calm before the storm. Jason took a step back, his face turning red with regret. His playful attitude was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. What had started as a simple joke was now beginning to feel much more serious. Jason realized that he might have misjudged the situation. Jason stood frozen for a moment, his hand still hanging in the air where he had just released the weapon. The silence felt heavier now. He had expected some sort of reaction, maybe a shout or a stern word from the guard, but there was only stillness. Jason's heartbeat quickened as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The tourists around him had stopped talking and were staring, some of them whispering to each other. He could feel all eyes on him now, and he felt exposed, like a spotlight was on his every move. For a brief second, Jason thought about walking away, pretending like nothing had happened, but he knew deep down that he couldn't. The situation was far from funny now. The guard's cold, unblinking stare seemed to pierce right through him. It was as if the guard's silence spoke louder than words ever could. Jason shifted uncomfortably, looking around, hoping for something, anything, to break the tension. And then, just as he started to step back, a new sound broke the stillness. The sharp clack of boots echoed across the courtyard. 2 security officers appeared from the side, their eyes immediately landing on Jason and the royal guard. Their expressions were serious, and they didn't waste a second as they approached. The crowd had quieted down, sensing the change in atmosphere, but Jason could feel his stomach drop. One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes scanning the situation carefully. "Is there a problem here?" he asked in a low, stern voice. Jason swallowed hard and tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. What could he say? Before he could even think of an answer, the royal guard took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Jason. The guard didn't speak a word, but his body language said everything. He was calm, yet there was a clear message in his posture, a warning, a silent command that this was not a situation to be taken lightly. The security officers exchanged a quick glance, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. Jason could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a harmless joke anymore. The officers' eyes moved between Jason and the guard, their faces serious as they tried to understand what had happened. Jason finally found his voice. I didn't mean any harm," he stammered, his face turning bright red. "It was just supposed to be a joke. I didn't think." He trailed off, feeling foolish. The officer who had spoken before didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave a small nod to the royal guard, as if asking for permission to continue. The guard didn't move, his face still expressionless, but the officer seemed to understand. "Tourists often forget," the officer said, his voice still calm but firm. "These guards are not here for entertainment. They're not statues. They are soldiers trained to protect." His words hung in the air, and Jason's heart sank lower as he realized the seriousness of his actions. Jason's mind raced. He had thought it would be funny. But now, in the presence of the royal guard and the security officers, he could see how wrong he was. The guard's silence spoke volumes about the seriousness of his position. The weapon Jason had touched wasn't just a prop. It was part of a history, part of a tradition that he had disrespected without even thinking about it. The officer took a deep breath before continuing. "This is a reminder that respect for authority is important. In this place, we honor tradition, and we expect visitors to do the same." Jason's cheeks burned as he realized the full weight of the moment. He wasn't just facing embarrassment. He was facing the consequences of not understanding the significance of the royal guard. His heart pounded as he realized how lucky he was that things hadn't escalated further. "Sorry," Jason said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was all he could think to say. The officer nodded once more and then turned to the guard, who, without saying a word, resumed his stance. Jason took a few steps back, his thoughts swirling with regret. The crowd, which had been watching the scene unfold, slowly began to disperse. The tension that had gripped the space started to lift, but for Jason, it would stay with him for much longer. Jason stood there for a few moments, trying to collect himself. His face felt like it was on fire, and his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He couldn't believe what had just happened. What started as a simple joke had spiraled into a situation far more serious than he ever imagined. As he slowly backed away from the royal guard, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building up in his chest. The security officers hadn't left yet. They were still standing nearby, watching Jason closely. The crowd that had gathered around them had started to break apart, but a few tourists still lingered, their eyes darting between Jason and the royal guard. Some were whispering among themselves, clearly discussing what had just happened. Jason tried to keep his head down, avoiding the stares of the people around him. He thought he heard someone laugh quietly behind him, but when he turned around, no one seemed to be looking his way anymore. The crowd had lost interest, but Jason's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had never expected things to go this far. He had only wanted to have a little fun, but now it seemed like he might have made a huge mistake. One of the officers walked toward him. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He was sure he was in trouble now. The officer was tall, with a stern expression that gave away no hint of emotion. Jason swallowed nervously as the officer stopped in front of him. "Are you okay?" the officer asked, his tone serious but not unfriendly. Jason nodded quickly, still feeling embarrassed. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It was just a joke. I didn't think it would be such a big deal," he said, his voice shaky. The officer looked at him for a moment, then glanced over at the royal guard, who had returned to his position, standing tall and still like a statue. The officer let out a small sigh, clearly aware of the weight of the situation. "You seem to be a bit shaken up," the officer said, his voice softer now. "It's good that you realize the seriousness of what just happened." Jason nodded again, his hands now feeling clammy. He felt like he was about to explode with nervous energy, but he was trying to stay calm. He had never felt so out of place before, and the more he thought about what he had done, the more he wished he could turn back time. The officer continued, "You see, these guards aren't just standing there for decoration. They have an important job. They are responsible for protecting the royal family and their history. Touching their weapons, or even getting too close, is something that can be seen as disrespectful." Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. He hadn't thought about it that way at all. He had been caught up in the idea of pulling off a funny stunt, but now he understood how wrong he had been. "I understand," Jason said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I just thought it would be funny." The officer's expression softened just slightly, though he still maintained his serious demeanor. "I can see that you didn't intend to cause harm, but sometimes intentions don't matter as much as the actions themselves," he said. "When you're here, you need to respect the traditions and roles that are in place. It's important for everyone to feel safe and respected." Jason nodded once more, taking the officer's words to heart. He hadn't thought about how the guard and the officers had a responsibility to uphold. He hadn't thought about the history behind the tradition of the royal guards, or how something as simple as touching a weapon could upset that balance. As the officer turned to leave, he glanced back at Jason one last time. "Just remember next time," he said, "respect goes both ways. You might want to consider what you would feel like if you were in the guard's shoes." Jason didn't have time to respond before the officer walked off. His words echoed in Jason's mind as he stood there, still processing everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that was weighing on him. He had thought he could get away with something harmless, but now he knew he had made a mistake. Looking over at the royal guard one last time, Jason realized how serious everything had been. The guard had not reacted out of anger or frustration. He had simply done his duty, staying calm and composed as he always had. Jason admired that. He had learned an important lesson in that moment, one that would stick with him for a long time. Jason's legs felt heavy as he slowly walked away from the royal guard and the security officers. His mind was still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. The guard, who had stood so still and unblinking, was now just another figure in Jason's memory, but the weight of the situation was hard to shake off. As he continued walking through the historic area, Jason tried to make sense of everything. He had thought that the royal guards were just a part of the city's history, something for tourists to admire from a distance. He never realized how much responsibility and honor went into their role. He had learned a painful lesson, but it was one he would not forget. The words the officer had said kept playing in Jason's mind. Respect goes both ways. It seemed simple, but it struck a deep chord with him. Jason had acted without thinking, assuming that the guards were just there for show. But now, he understood that they weren't just standing around for decoration. They were soldiers, dedicated to their duty, carrying out an important task, one that demanded respect. Jason's thoughts were interrupted when he noticed something different. As he wandered through the city, he came across a group of tourists taking pictures near a large fountain. A few of them were joking around, posing for silly photos in front of the guards, who were standing nearby. Jason felt a twinge of frustration. He had done the same thing just moments ago, but now he saw it from a different perspective. It wasn't that people shouldn't be allowed to enjoy their time, but Jason realized that there was a certain line that shouldn't be crossed. The guards were not there for amusement, and their duty was not something that should be taken lightly. He thought back to how the officer had explained the importance of tradition and the guard's role. He had thought that the guard's silence was just a sign of discipline, but now he knew it was a reminder of the respect that had to be given. Jason couldn't help but feel a bit ashamed. The royal guard he had interacted with had not reacted in anger, as Jason had feared. Instead, the guard had remained calm, professional, and still. His silence had been a statement in itself, an unspoken reminder of his responsibility. The more Jason thought about it, the more he understood just how much strength it took to remain so composed in the face of distractions. jokes, and sometimes disrespect. As he walked deeper into the historic site, Jason started to see the guards in a new light. They were not just soldiers. They were guardians of something far greater than themselves. They stood for tradition, for the history of the kingdom, and for the values that had been passed down for generations. Jason had been fortunate that the guard hadn't chosen to escalate the situation. He had shown restraint, something Jason now respected deeply. Jason paused for a moment, reflecting on how much he had learned in such a short time. His actions had not been meant to disrespect anyone, but he had still crossed a line. He understood now that respect wasn't just about following rules. It was about recognizing the significance of the people and traditions around you. As Jason continued walking, he made a vow to himself. The next time he visited a place like this, he would take the time to understand its history, its people, and its customs. He didn't want to make the same mistake again. When he reached the edge of the area, Jason looked back one final time at the royal guard, who was still standing tall and silent. There was something powerful in that stillness, something that had made Jason realize that respect was not just something given freely. It was earned through actions, through silence, and through duty. And for the first time that day, Jason felt proud of the lesson he had learned. Jason continued to walk, his feet guiding him through the beautiful streets of the historic city, but his mind was still far away. The events of the past hour kept replaying in his head. He couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard and the way everything had unfolded. He had learned something today, but it was something he hadn't expected. As he passed by cafes and shops, he couldn't help but notice how different everything felt now. The laughter of tourists, the chatter in the air, and the excitement of the day, none of it seemed quite as lighthearted as it had before. Jason now realized that he had been part of something much larger than himself. The royal guard, the traditions they stood for, the respect they demanded. He had only scratched the surface of what it all meant. Jason stopped at a bench near a small park and sat down, feeling the weight of his thoughts. He had been so quick to treat the guards like part of the background scenery. He had been caught up in the idea of impressing his friends and making a joke. But now he saw things differently. He had been wrong to treat the guard's duty as a game. What made him think that it was okay to grab the weapon of someone whose job was to protect the royal family? He thought back to the officer's words, "Respect goes both ways." Jason had been so focused on having fun that he hadn't stopped to consider how his actions might affect someone else. The guard wasn't just a figure standing there for tourists to take photos with. The guard was part of a long-standing tradition. Jason had taken that tradition for granted. As he sat on the bench, Jason began to think about other moments in his life when he had acted without thinking. There had been times when he had made light of things or joked around when he should have been more serious. Today, however, was different. Today, he had learned a lesson that he knew would stay with him forever. It wasn't just about respect for the royal guards. It was about understanding the value of tradition and the people who keep it alive. Jason smiled slightly to himself, realizing how lucky he was that the situation hadn't escalated. The officer could have taken more serious action, but instead, he had explained things calmly, allowing Jason the chance to reflect. And the royal guard, who had remained silent throughout, had shown him a lesson in patience and discipline that Jason would never forget. It was easy to take things for granted when you didn't fully understand their importance. Jason had learned the hard way that respect couldn't be earned by words alone. It had to be demonstrated through actions. He had made a mistake, but now he had the chance to grow from it. As the hours passed and the day began to wind down, Jason started to feel better. He realized that making mistakes was part of being human. What mattered was learning from them. He wasn't perfect, but he could do better next time. And the next time he traveled to a new place, he would be more mindful of the customs and the people who made that place special. Jason stood up from the bench, feeling a sense of relief. He was grateful for the lesson he had learned, even if it had been an uncomfortable experience. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. with a new perspective on the day and the people around him. Jason continued his walk through the city, more aware and respectful than ever before. He knew he would never forget the royal guard who had silently taught him the importance of respect, patience, and understanding. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Jason slowly made his way back to the area where the royal guard stood. His mind felt clearer now, the rush of embarrassment fading into a quiet sense of understanding. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like he needed to return to where it all started, to face the situation one more time, to fully grasp the lesson he had learned. Jason arrived at the same spot, where the royal guard was still standing perfectly still. He couldn't help but admire the guard's ability to remain so composed, so focused. The guard was doing his duty, as he always had, without showing any sign of weakness or frustration. Jason now understood the depth of the guard's position. It wasn't just about standing still, it was about representing something much bigger than himself. Jason felt a mixture of respect and awe. As he stood there quietly, he realized that he had taken something that required immense strength and patience for granted. The guard wasn't just a person standing in a uniform. He was part of a tradition that had been passed down through generations. That responsibility was not something to be played with. He walked a little closer, not to joke around, but to silently acknowledge the guard's presence. The more Jason looked at the guard, the more he appreciated the discipline it took to maintain such stillness. It wasn't just about keeping the uniform neat or standing at attention. It was about upholding the values of the royal family and the kingdom they protected. The crowd had thinned out, and Jason was almost alone now. He stood there for a few moments, feeling an overwhelming sense of humility. He had made a mistake earlier, but he was determined not to make the same mistake again. His earlier impulsiveness had been a lesson, one that he would carry with him. At that moment, the officer who had spoken to him earlier appeared again, this time walking with a calm, measured pace. He gave Jason a nod of acknowledgement, but didn't speak immediately. Jason wasn't sure what to say. What could he say? He already knew the importance of what he had done wrong, and he wasn't looking for more punishment. He had learned what he needed to. The officer stopped a few feet away from Jason, his gaze briefly shifting toward the royal guard before turning back to Jason. "I see you've had some time to think," the officer said, his tone steady but kind. Jason nodded, a little unsure of how to respond. "Yes, I've been thinking a lot. I realize now how wrong I was. I didn't understand how serious it was to interact with the guards like that. I've learned my lesson." The officer studied Jason for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he spoke again. "I can see that you're sincere. What you did was wrong, yes, but I also see that you've reflected on it. Sometimes it takes a mistake to learn the right way to behave." Jason felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been expecting to hear that he had done something unforgivable, that there would be more consequences. But instead, the officer's words made him feel like his mistake was part of a larger learning process. The officer continued, "The royal guards have one of the most important roles in this kingdom. They don't just stand still for show. They stand for the protection of our history, our people, and our future. The respect we show them reflects how we honor these things. Today, you've learned that lesson." Jason looked at the royal guard again, who still stood silently, unmoved. The words felt heavier now, and Jason understood them completely. The guard wasn't just protecting the royal family. He was protecting a long, rich tradition that held deep meaning for the people. Jason took a deep breath, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you. I'll never forget this. I'll make sure to respect the traditions and people I encounter from now on." The officer gave a small, approving nod. That's all anyone can ask for. Learn, grow, and respect the things that matter. With that, the officer turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing there, looking at the royal guard. Jason knew he had made a mistake, but he also knew he had learned something valuable. He felt grateful for the lesson and for the chance to make things right. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason quietly walked away, carrying with him a new understanding of respect and the importance of tradition. The day had started with a joke, but it ended with a lesson he would never forget. As Jason walked through the historic city once more, the events of the past few hours lingered in his mind. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the ancient buildings, but Jason didn't feel the same excitement he had earlier. The fun, carefree mood he had started the day with had turned into something deeper, more reflective. His steps were slower now, each one carrying more weight than before. He glanced around, seeing the tourists laughing, taking photos, and enjoying the sights, but he couldn't help but feel that he had learned something important. Something that went beyond just respecting the royal guard. It was about understanding the true meaning behind everything he had witnessed today. Jason had spent most of his trip taking things for granted. He had never really thought about the role of the royal guards or why they stood in place for hours, unmoving. It had never occurred to him that the stillness and silence they maintained held so much value. But now, after everything that had happened, he knew that their duty was about more than just protecting the royal family. It was about preserving a history, a culture, and a way of life that had been passed down through generations. Jason thought back to the officer's words. Respect goes both ways. He realized that respect wasn't something that could be demanded with force. It had to be earned, understood, and given willingly. He hadn't earned the guard's respect when he first touched the weapon, but now he felt that he had a better understanding of what that respect meant. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw a small group of tourists approaching the area where the royal guard stood. Jason had learned his lesson, and he couldn't help but watch as they smiled and posed for photos in front of the guard, clearly unaware of the significance behind his presence. He wanted to say something, to remind them of what he had learned, but he stopped himself. Jason realized that it wasn't his place to teach others. What mattered was that he had learned a lesson for himself. He had understood the value of respecting traditions, understanding the roles of others, and recognizing the history behind every place and person. As he walked away from the crowd, Jason noticed something, a shift in his own thinking. The world around him seemed more meaningful now. He noticed the small details that he had overlooked before, like the way the leaves rustled in the wind, the smiles of the people walking by, and the quiet presence of the royal guard in the background. Everything felt more alive, more connected. Jason wasn't angry at himself for making a mistake. He had accepted it, and he knew that mistakes were part of learning. What mattered was that he had taken responsibility and had grown from the experience. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about understanding, about learning from the past, and about making sure he didn't make the same mistake again. As he left the area and continued his walk through the city, Jason felt lighter, more at peace with himself. He had learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He was grateful for the opportunity to learn, even though the lesson had come in an unexpected way. The last thing Jason saw before leaving the city was the royal guard, still standing tall and proud, his posture as perfect as ever. Jason gave a quiet nod of respect, knowing that he now understood what the guard represented. He had learned what it meant to truly respect something, not just by words, but by actions. As he headed back to his hotel, Jason felt a sense of closure. He had made a mistake, but he had learned from it. And in that, he had grown. The trip had started with a joke, but it had ended with a lesson, one that would stay with him for a long time. Jason's trip was nearing its end, and the events of the past few days weighed on his mind. He had come to the city to experience its history, its beauty, and its culture, but what he had learned wasn't something he had expected. It wasn't just about visiting the famous landmarks or taking pictures with the royal guards. It was about understanding the deeper meaning behind them. He had made a mistake with the royal guard, but in doing so, he had learned a valuable lesson about respect, tradition, and the importance of understanding the roles of others. Now, with only a day left in the city, Jason was determined to make the most of it, not by rushing to see more sights, but by really taking the time to understand what he was seeing. The morning sun had already begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the city. Jason stepped out of his hotel and onto the cobblestone streets. The air was fresh, and the city seemed peaceful. He could still hear the sounds of tourists laughing and chatting, but now they didn't seem as loud or distracting. Everything felt more balanced, as if he had gained a new perspective. As Jason walked toward the palace grounds once more, he found himself reflecting on the royal guard he had interacted with. He still remembered the guard's stillness, the way he had remained silent through it all. Jason now saw that silence as strength, not weakness. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful message wasn't spoken, it was simply shown through actions. He arrived at the same spot where he had made his mistake, but this time he didn't feel nervous or out of place. He had learned to appreciate the silence of the guard, the calm authority that came with his presence. There was no need for words or jokes anymore. Jason understood now. He had learned that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly, and he was grateful for the opportunity to understand it on a deeper level. As he stood there, watching the royal guard, Jason saw a group of new tourists approaching. They were laughing and chatting excitedly, eager to take photos in front of the guard. But Jason didn't feel annoyed or frustrated like he had before. Instead, he simply smiled, knowing that everyone was on their own journey of learning and understanding. Some might learn the same lessons he had, and others might not, but that was okay. Jason had already changed. He had learned something about himself, how important it was to understand the significance of the things around him, and to always approach others with respect. The royal guard had shown him that strength came not from showing off or making jokes, but from holding steady, remaining composed, and understanding the value of tradition. The tourists passed by, taking their photos and chatting with each other, and Jason watched the royal guard once more. He gave a small nod, silently acknowledging the guard's presence, knowing that this small gesture was a sign of his growth. As the day went on, Jason explored more of the city, visiting places he hadn't taken the time to truly notice before. Each step felt different now, more mindful, more appreciative. He didn't rush through the streets or try to check off a list of attractions. Instead, he took the time to sit in the parks, admire the architecture, and reflect on the history he was walking through. When it was time to leave the city, Jason felt a deep sense of peace. He had come for a vacation, but he was leaving with something much more valuable: an understanding of respect, tradition, and the importance of learning from mistakes. His time in the city had taught him that it was never too late to grow, to learn, and to change. As he boarded the plane back home, Jason smiled to himself. The royal guard had taught him a lesson he would never forget, and he was leaving the city with a new sense of purpose. The journey had started with a joke, but it had ended with something far more meaningful, a deeper connection to the world around him.